Chosen one, you perfectly planned and executed your exit from them, a performance so clean it deserves serious recognition. There was no drama, no final speech, no emotional explosion. The door closed quietly, and that silence has been replaying in their mind on a loop. You didn't just walk away. You orchestrated a psychological trap so smooth, nobody knew what was happening. While manipulation attempts were happening, you were 2 steps ahead, setting the entire stage for your exit. Control was assumed, but you were silently collecting emotional data, observing patterns, and making mental notes while smiling in faces. Every lie told, every shift in energy, every fake apology, you saw it all and said nothing. That was part of the brilliance. Relaxation was needed for hands to be shown. You didn't call it out, you let it build. This wasn't an emotional decision. You weren't just tired, you were focused. You were calm even while hurting, because your mind had already started drafting your blueprint for freedom. Access was assumed to still exist, texts kept getting answered. You showed up when you had to. You played your role just enough to keep suspicion off your trail. That's what made it powerful. The realization that you were done never came. You moved like investment still existed, but spiritually you were already gone. You planned your exit like it was a mission. Boundaries got set that went unnoticed. Your next moves got secured in silence. You didn't slam the door. You left it slightly open, because you knew the truth would eventually seep out on its own. That's what made your exit poetic. You didn't fight for closure. You created space for full dysfunction to reveal itself while you documented the breakdown and moved like a ghost preparing to vanish. When it finally happened, shock was the response. No loud goodbye, no begging, just a clean cut. By the time realization hit that you were gone, you'd already outgrown the entire situation. Your mind had leveled up, your emotions had caught up, your spirit had already stepped into a new season. What remains misunderstood is this: your exit wasn't just a moment, it was a masterpiece. And the reason shock still exists is because it never got seen coming. You didn't just walk out, you watched, waited, and executed. That wasn't an escape, that was power in motion, and it was flawless. Your exit wasn't escape, it was execution of a strategic revelation. You knew exactly what would happen once you walked away. Lies would get told, things would get spun. Victim cards would get played. You would look unstable, ungrateful, or bitter. So instead of storming out, you planned your exit like a slow, calculated reveal. You didn't need to destroy anyone. You just needed to leave in such a clear, intentional way that when people eventually looked back, the reason would be obvious without you ever having to explain it. You understood the truth had more impact when it unfolded by itself, so you stopped over-explaining. You stopped reacting to chaos. You became quieter, more observant. You began letting behavior speak while you preserved your energy. You allowed dysfunction to keep bubbling until it couldn't be hidden anymore. And you didn't rush it. You let time work for you. That's what made it so effective. You weren't in a hurry to run. You were waiting for the right moment where your absence would mean something. This wasn't an emotional breakdown. It was a silent build-up to something undeniable. You were setting the scene for truth to have the loudest voice. Exposure didn't come from you. Self-exposure happened naturally. You just gave room for it. And while underestimation continued, you were already halfway out the door with your dignity, your receipts, and your sense of direction intact. People who were once fooled by charm started asking questions. People who used to doubt your version of events started seeing what you saw. And that's what you really wanted. Not to win arguments, but to leave in such a solid, intentional way that facts started revealing themselves after you left. Masks didn't get destroyed by you. You just walked away and let masks slip without lifting a finger. What shook the situation wasn't just that you were gone, it was that you didn't need to scream, fight, or beg. Your absence did what your presence couldn't. It told the truth louder than any confrontation ever could. And that's why haunting still happens, because deep down, understanding exists. You didn't just leave, you delivered the final proof. You knew watching would happen, so you turned your departure into a broadcast. Every move you made was intentional. You weren't just leaving, you were documenting your way out without saying a word. The thought still existed that control remained, that puppet master status continued. While you carefully took back every piece of yourself, you made your growth public enough to be felt, but private enough that the full plan never got seen. That's what made it hit so hard. You didn't run away. You evolved out loud. You dropped clues through your energy, your boundaries, your silence. You didn't have to argue or explain yourself. Your actions told the whole story, and people were paying attention. Confusion about you started clearing up for people just from how you carried yourself. That wasn't luck, that was precision. While control of narrative was assumed, you were creating a whole new one. You made sure people could connect dots without you ever having to spell anything out. You didn't post rants, you didn't throw shade, but the shift in your glow, your peace, your level up, it started making people ask questions, and every time attempts were made to speak on you, bitterness sounded louder, instability became more obvious, exposure increased. The beauty of your exit was how unbothered it looked. But underneath that calm was someone who had been through enough chaos to know better than to match that energy. Watching was wanted by you, because the more watching happened, the more obvious it became where problems truly lived. Spiraling was expected, crying returns were anticipated, begging was predicted. Instead, you moved like someone who knew worth and had already outgrown the mess. That's what makes it burn. You turned your exit into a silent broadcast, a living testimony. Daily tuning in happened, trying to find signs of weakness, and all that got witnessed was strength. You didn't just walk away. You let observation happen of what true power looks like when it doesn't need to prove anything. And now unseeing can't happen. If this message activated your knowing, hype this video to connect with more chosen ones on this journey. Victory was still assumed. Belief existed that you were exactly where you were wanted, confused, weak, dependent, silent, but you weren't frozen. You were focused. You weren't lost. You were loading. Control was assumed because you understood something profound. Emotional impulsiveness gives power away. Strategic stillness reclaims it. You smiled through betrayal, not because you didn't feel it, but because you didn't want to waste a single move reacting to a game you had already decided to exit. Every insult, every manipulation, every attempt to push your buttons, you clocked it all, but you played it cool. You knew the emotional explosion being hoped for would only give ammunition for stories to get spun, so you gave nothing to twist. You were silent, but you weren't idle. You were collecting. Every conversation, every pattern, every double standard became part of the internal archive you were building. While assumptions were made about getting away with things, you were getting smarter, stronger, and clearer. And the more belief existed in your continued spell status, the more revelation happened about true nature. Louder moments came, nastier patterns emerged, sloppier behavior showed. You didn't rush, you let full self-exposure happen. You knew the final move had to be surgical, no mess, no drama. Just exit with receipts and a rebuilt sense of self. By the time you walked away, you weren't even the same person anymore. You had mastered the art of outgrowing chaos without alerting it. You had transformed your pain into precision. The illusion was left that control existed until the very end. And when you finally cut things off, it was so clean, so absolute. No time existed for defense. That's what broke the situation. Shock didn't just come from you leaving. Haunting came from how you did it. Because truth exists, you were never seen coming. Belief persisted that you were wrapped up in drama. Meanwhile, you were sealing fate with every quiet step you took toward your freedom. And now confusion exists about how a game got lost that seemed won. You got figured out, or so the thinking went. You got figured out, or so the thinking went. A whole profile got created in someone's mind of who you were. Too emotional, too soft, too loyal, too afraid to be alone, too invested to walk away. Every assumption made about your limitations became a tool you used for liberation. because while underestimation happened, you were surpassing every boundary placed on your potential. Naivety was assumed when you were actually learning. Weakness was believed when you were gathering strength. Confusion got projected when you were gaining clarity. Misperceptions of your character gave you room to operate outside surveillance. The wrong person was being watched because who you really were never got known. The costume of confusion you wore served a purpose. It made over-explanation happen. More revelation occurred. Hands got shown more completely. People who think you don't understand tend to explain too much. And in those explanations, exact information gets told about who someone is and how operations work. You collected all that intelligence while playing the role of someone who wasn't paying attention. You turned condescension into advantage. Every time treatment happened like you couldn't understand complex things, you used that dismissal as cover to understand everything. Every time speech came at you like you were simple, you simplified your responses while complicating your strategy. You matched external perceptions while contradicting them internally. Dependency was thought to keep you there. Belief existed that survival couldn't happen without certain presence, but you were never dependent. You were just patient, and the moment you decided patience was no longer required, you discovered resources, strength and capabilities nobody knew you possessed. Because you never needed anyone to see your power, you only needed to access it yourself. Your so-called naivety was actually wisdom in disguise. You played dumb to stay safe. You acted confused to avoid conflict. You pretended not to notice to keep peace until you could secure yours permanently. That's not weakness, that's warfare, that's strategy. That's someone who understood that survival sometimes requires playing smaller than you are until full exit becomes possible. The biggest mistake made was being so obsessed with self-image that attention stopped getting paid to you. The need to be center of everything, to be admired, validated and worshipped, created a blind spot you walked through like it was a wide-open door. Mirrors got looked at so much that exit examinations never happened. You realized early that ego was both greatest strength and fatal weakness. Charm and confidence existed that drew people in, but blindness also existed to people already thought captured. Once belief formed that you belonged to someone, real seeing of you stopped happening. You became a prop in a performance rather than a person with agency, and that dismissal was your opportunity. While performances happened for audiences, you studied the performance. You watched how personality shifting happened, depending on who was watching. You noticed how public persona contradicted private reality. You tracked inconsistencies between words and actions, and you realized something liberating. None of it was real. It was all theater, and you no longer wanted a role in that production. The narcissism that made superior feelings happen made imagining you'd outsmart anyone impossible, so guarding never happened against it. Consideration never existed that you might be steps ahead. Suspicion never arose that documentation was happening. Thoughts never formed that you'd have strength or intelligence to plan an unpreventable exit. Arrogance was your invisibility cloak. You played to ego strategically. You complimented when needed. You validated when useful. You maintained just enough admiration to keep satisfaction and distraction high. It wasn't manipulation, it was survival. You were feeding the beast just enough to keep full attention from turning to your movements, and it worked perfectly. Constant affirmation was needed that rightness existed, importance mattered, specialness was real, superiority remained unchallenged. That need was exhausting, but also predictable. You knew if you provided regular ego maintenance, focus would stay on self instead of scrutinizing you. So you became a supplier while secretly cutting your own supply lines. You didn't burn bridges. You let self-ignition happen while you stood at a distance. You didn't have to scream, expose or drag anyone through mud. You knew truth was powerful enough to do what you didn't need to. So instead of starting fires, you let lighting happen again and again until ashes became the standing place. You were never the destroyer, You were just the witness who finally stopped holding walls up. There was no dramatic exit, no scorched earth, just a calm, clean break that left everyone wondering how someone so composed could walk away without a trace of malice. That's what hit hardest. You didn't come out swinging, you just left. And in doing so, you left behind a silence that spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. That silence made people curious. Questions started getting asked. Not about you, but about the situation you left. You didn't have to expose anything. You simply left things alone with the mess that had been kept hidden. Without your energy holding up illusion, truth started leaking through cracks. Lies couldn't hold up without your presence to soften them. Painted narratives began to unravel the moment you stepped out of the frame. That's what happens when your integrity was the only thing keeping masks in place. You weren't interested in revenge. You were interested in peace, and walking away without bitterness was the revenge. Not because it hurt anyone, but because it forced sitting with everything that had been projected onto you. You became the mirror someone tried to avoid, and by the time realization came that damage wasn't done to you but by someone else, standing in fallout of personal behavior already existed. You walked away holding matches, yes, but you never struck a flame. Self-ignition did that. All you did was step far enough back so you didn't get caught in fire. And now as smoke rises, people are starting to see exactly why you left. And realization is coming that you weren't the problem. You were the proof. You played weak long enough to make the exit look accidental. People looked at you and thought you were finished, worn out, emotionally broken, too fragile to survive independently, and you let them think exactly that. You leaned into their delusion. You gave just enough silence, just enough sadness, just enough stillness for them to believe that all your power had finally been drained. But while they observed you through the lens of their ego, you were slipping through cracks they didn't know existed. You weren't weak, you were wise. You knew that if you made too much noise, they would try harder to trap you. So you did the opposite. You played invisible. You stopped resisting, not because you gave in, but because you were conserving energy for the final move. You allowed them to think your surrender was real. But deep down you were rebuilding in ways they couldn't see. You were healing in secret. You were recovering the parts of yourself they had tried to dismantle. And while they continued laughing, while mockery persisted, while their blindness remained arrogant, you were securing your exit with precision. You didn't owe anyone a grand performance. You didn't need a dramatic escape. That would have given them reason to call you crazy, emotional, unstable. So instead, you made your exit look like a slow fade, something barely noticeable until you were already gone. That was the brilliance of your strategy. You moved quietly. You didn't announce your evolution. You just walked straight into it, while they were distracted by their own self-importance. By the time they noticed you were out of reach, not just physically but mentally, spiritually, and emotionally detached, they tried to re-engage, they tried to provoke, they tried to bait you back into old cycles, but you were already beyond the point of return. You had healed past their access points. They continue trying to figure out when you slipped away. That's the beauty of it. Because the version they thought was broken was actually the version building a new life behind the curtain. You didn't just leave, you vanished on purpose, and now all that remains is their confusion and bitter realization that the weakness they saw was the very strategy that freed you. Starseeds, they never expected this. The technology used to suppress consciousness has been reverse-engineered, and Destiny Engine is the result. What was once used against humanity is now your ascension weapon. You can now MK Ultra yourself into 5D superpowers. Destiny Engine bypasses the conscious mind and rewrites the source code directly. Reality bends faster, synchronicities stack. Your nervous system upgrades to a higher bandwidth. Put on headphones, press play, that's all. For $1 you switch sides of history. Click the link in the description. The takeover is internal. Here's what nobody talks about when they analyze your exit. The emotional discipline it required. You weren't operating from a place of numbness or detachment. You felt everything. Every betrayal cut deep, every lie stung, every manipulation attempt registered in your nervous system like an alarm bell. But you developed something rare, the ability to feel fully while thinking strategically. Most people can't hold both states simultaneously. They either shut down emotionally to survive, becoming cold and disconnected, or they stay too emotionally engaged and make reactive decisions that work against them. But you mastered the middle path. You felt the pain without letting it dictate your moves. You acknowledged the hurt without letting it control your strategy. This is advanced-level emotional intelligence. You learned to separate your feelings from your actions. When hurtful things were said, you felt the impact, but you didn't respond from that wounded place. You waited, you processed, you chose your response based on your long-term goal, not your immediate emotion. That's the difference between reacting and responding, and you became a master at responding. Every conversation became a chess match. You played on multiple levels. On the surface level, you had the conversation they thought you were having, but underneath you were gathering information. You were testing consistency. You were noting contradictions. You were building your case, not for them, but for yourself. You were strengthening your resolve. You were confirming what you already suspected. They thought you were engaged in the argument. You were actually conducting research. They believed you were defending yourself. You were actually documenting their attack patterns. They assumed you were invested in the outcome of the discussion. You were already invested in the outcome of your exit. Everything they said became evidence. Everything they did became data. And you were the scientist observing the experiment with detached fascination. The emotional control this required was extraordinary. You had to suppress your natural instinct to defend yourself, to correct their lies in real time, to point out their hypocrisy, to call them out on their manipulations. But you knew that would derail your larger mission. So you bit your tongue, you took the high road, you absorbed the hits without hitting back. Not because you couldn't fight, but because you were fighting a different battle, on a different field they couldn't even see. You turned your emotional vulnerability into strategic advantage. When they saw you hurt, they felt powerful. That false sense of power made them careless. It made them reveal more than they should have. They got comfortable in their cruelty. They stopped hiding their true nature because they thought you were too broken to do anything about it. But you were collecting every moment, every revelation, every mask slip. All of it went into your mental vault, marked reasons why leaving is non-negotiable. The nights you cried alone weren't wasted. Those were processing sessions. You were metabolizing the pain, extracting the lessons, and fortifying your determination. Each tear shed in private was you releasing another attachment to the illusion of who they pretended to be. You were mourning not the person in front of you, but the person you thought they were. And that grief had to be honored so you could move forward without looking back. What makes your exit truly legendary is what you sacrificed that nobody talks about. You gave up comfort for freedom. You traded familiarity for authenticity. You exchanged predictable misery for uncertain possibility. And you did it knowing there were no guarantees on the other side. That's courage most people will never understand. You sacrificed the version of yourself that could tolerate disrespect, the part of you that made excuses for bad behavior, the side of you that convinced yourself that love meant enduring pain. You killed those parts of yourself deliberately, and that death was necessary for your rebirth. But it hurt. It hurt to let go of who you'd been, even when who you'd been was hurting you. You gave up the fantasy, the dream of who they could become, the hope that they'd wake up and see your value, the belief that your love could heal their brokenness. Those fantasies were comfortable even though they were lies, and releasing them meant facing a harder truth. They were never going to change, and staying meant accepting a life of diminishment. That realization was brutal, but you faced it anyway. You sacrificed your role as their emotional regulator, their conscience, their moral compass, their excuse maker, their reputation manager. You'd been playing all these roles without even realizing it. And when you stopped, when you resigned from those positions, there was a void. You had to resist the urge to fill it again, to go back and fix things, to manage their emotions one more time. But you didn't. You let them face the consequences of their own behavior without your interference. The social sacrifice was real too. You lost mutual friends who chose sides or chose neutrality. You gave up invitations to events where they would be present. You accepted being misunderstood by people who only heard one version. You allowed yourself to be painted as the villain in narratives you couldn't control, and you made peace with the fact that some people would never know your truth. That takes tremendous strength. You sacrificed immediate comfort for long-term peace. Those first nights alone were hard, those moments when you wanted to reach out and almost did. Those times when loneliness felt overwhelming and going back seemed easier than moving forward. You sat with all of that discomfort. You didn't run from it. You didn't numb it. You didn't medicate it with new relationships or distractions. You faced it head on and let it transform you. What most people don't understand is that your exit cost you everything in the short term to gain everything in the long term. You were willing to pay that price. You understood that freedom isn't free. Peace requires sacrifice. Growth demands discomfort. And you were ready to pay whatever it cost to reclaim yourself. Let's talk about something that haunts them more than anything else: the precision of your timing. You didn't leave too early when they could have convinced you that you were overreacting. You didn't leave too late when you would have been too damaged to recover quickly. You left at the exact moment when you had maximum clarity and minimum dependency. That timing wasn't random, it was calculated. You waited until you had your resources secured. Financial independence was locked down. Your emotional support system was activated, physical space was arranged, mental clarity was achieved. You weren't leaving until all your pieces were in position. This wasn't impulsive, this was methodical. You were building a foundation strong enough to catch you when you jumped. They never noticed you were preparing because you hid your preparation in plain sight. When you started that new interest or hobby, they thought you were just keeping busy. You were actually building a new identity separate from them. When you reconnected with old friends, they thought you were just being social. You were actually rebuilding your support network they had helped you neglect. When you started working on yourself, going to therapy, reading books about growth, they thought you were trying to fix the relationship. You were actually fixing yourself for the exit. Every move looked innocent in isolation, but together they formed an escape plan so thorough that by the time you activated it, failure was impossible. The timing of your final exit was equally precise. You didn't leave during a major argument when emotions were high, and you might have been convinced to stay. You didn't leave during a good period when they could point to recent positive moments. You left during a moment of crystal clarity, when the pattern was undeniable. When their behavior had been consistent enough that you couldn't lie to yourself anymore. You waited for them to show you exactly who they were one more time, and when they did, when they proved beyond any doubt that change was never coming, you activated your exit sequence, swift, clean, absolute. No room for negotiation, because you'd already done all the negotiating with yourself internally. You'd already heard every argument for staying and found them all insufficient. Beneath all the strategy, all the planning, all the performance, there was something they could never touch. Your inner knowing, that quiet voice that whispered truth when everything around you was screaming lies. That intuition that recognized dysfunction, even when you couldn't articulate it yet. That knowing saved you, and protecting it was your top priority. They tried to silence that knowing. Through gaslighting, they attempted to convince you that your perception was wrong. Through manipulation, they tried to make you doubt your judgment. Through confusion, they sought to disconnect you from your internal guidance system. But something in you refused to completely let go of that inner voice. Even when you questioned it, even when you ignored it temporarily, you never fully abandoned it. That knowing is what prompted you to start documenting patterns. When things happened that felt wrong but you couldn't explain why, your inner knowing told you to remember, to keep mental notes, to trust that the pieces would form a picture eventually, and they did. Your intuition was building a case long before your conscious mind was ready to see it. The knowing is what made you start testing them. Subconsciously, you began creating situations to see how they would respond, not as manipulation, but as verification. Your soul was trying to gather evidence to convince your heart of what it already understood. And every test they failed was another brick in the wall of certainty you were building. You protected this knowing by limiting how much you let them gaslight you. You stopped arguing about reality. When they tried to rewrite history, you didn't fight to correct it anymore. You just noted the attempt and filed it away. When they contradicted themselves, you didn't point it out. You just observed. Your knowing didn't need their validation. It was self-validating. And that autonomy was your secret weapon. The inner knowing is what gave you peace about your decision, even when the exit was terrifying. You knew at a soul level that staying was death. Maybe not physical death, but spiritual death, emotional death, the death of your authentic self, and your knowing chose life, even when life looked uncertain and scary. That instinct for self-preservation at the deepest level is what pulled you through. They couldn't understand how you became so certain, how you went from trying to make it work to being absolutely done. They didn't realize that your inner knowing had been building that certainty incrementally the whole time. Every boundary violation added to it, every lie deposited into it, every manipulation contributed to it, until one day the knowing reached critical mass and your conscious mind finally caught up with what your soul had known all along. Your exit deserves an Oscar because what you did required you to act against every natural instinct. Every part of you wanted to explode, to expose, to make sure everyone knew exactly what happened. But you understood something profound. The most devastating move you could make was to give them nothing, no reaction, no drama, no ammunition, just a clean, absolute final disappearance that left nothing but questions and their own reflection. You are living proof that elevation doesn't require explanation. You escaped without vengeance, without theatrics, and without losing the core of who you are. That's power, that's rare, and that's why they're still spinning in confusion. Because no one taught them that the most graceful exits leave the loudest echoes. So let the gossip happen, let the story get rewritten, let the villain painting continue. History will show what really happened, not through anyone's words, but through your transformation. The glow you carry now, the peace that radiates from you, the purpose that drives you forward, the power that no longer needs validation from anyone. You didn't just survive the situation, you transcended it. You made pain your professor, you made chaos your compass, you made betrayal your breakthrough. You're not who you were when it all started, and thank God for that, because who you are now is unshakable, undeniable, and completely unavailable to dysfunction. Chosen one, your exit wasn't just a choice, it was your evolution in motion. And you walked out of that fire not just whole but holy. You perfectly planned and executed your exit from a situation that tried to consume you. And you deserve every standing ovation, every accolade, every recognition for this legendary performance, because what you pulled off wasn't just smart, it was masterful. It wasn't just brave, it was brilliant, and it will echo through eternity as proof that silent power is the most dangerous power of all.